I was talking to a systems engineer in Tokyo recently, standing near the government district. He pointed up at the endless web of power lines and data cables woven through the skyline and said, with this distinct tone of pride, everything runs through here. The voltage, the data, the decisions, it all syncs to Tokyo time. To him, this was the ultimate achievement. A perfectly calibrated machine where the capital acts as the brain and the rest of the country is just the body doing its bidding.
Yeah.
He saw it as strength.
The peak of efficiency.
Exactly. But then you look at the reality of that map and the feeling shifts from awe to anxiety. That strength is actually a terrified grip. It turns out that despite the illusion of a national network, Japan's infrastructure is rigged so that if the capital sneezes, the rest of the nation catches pneumonia. It's not a web, it's a leash.
That's a powerful way to put it.
And here's where it gets really strange. While Japan is doubling down on this suffocating centralization, look at what's happening in the Himalayas. Bhutan, a country usually associated with monks and isolation, is quietly pulling off a sci-fi level maneuver.
A complete 180 from Japan's approach.
Completely. They aren't routing everything to a capital city. Instead, they are plugging their rivers directly into the blockchain, turning water into decentralized digital sovereignty. It creates this jarring contradiction. The futuristic, high-tech giant is actually building a single point of failure, while the quiet mountain kingdom is building an indestructible, distributed heart.
And that really gets to the core question, doesn't it?
It makes you ask the question, is Tokyo's efficiency actually just a fancy disguise for fragility?
Welcome to the deep dive. And that opening contrast is, I think, just critical. You have this centralized fragility of a modern hypercapital
Tokyo
versus the distributed digital sovereignty being built in a mountain kingdom. So for you, the listener, our mission today is to go deep into the source material, comparing these two radically different models.
Right, two completely different philosophies of what makes a nation strong.
Exactly. We're here to extract the insights that define what true modern resilience even looks like, especially when you're dealing with that fundamental tension between efficiency and, well, survival.
So we need to look at the vulnerabilities of these centralized systems.
We do, and then analyze how a nation can use decentralized tech for its own sovereignty, and ultimately, understand the systemic cost of getting rid of redundancy.
Okay, so let's start by unpacking that centralized model, what we're calling Japan's capital monster. This isn't just about bureaucracy, it's physical, right? And it seems like the foundation of that fragility is all in the energy grid.
That's absolutely where the story begins. You really can't understand Japan's energy vulnerability without starting with what's known as the 50-60 hertz wall.
A wall.
A wall. And this is not a political fault line or anything like that. It's a literal physical electrical divide that goes all the way back to 19th century purchasing decisions.
So like a historical clerical error that now has massive national security implications more than a century later.
That's a perfect way to describe it. Exactly. When Japan started modernizing, the East, centered around Tokyo, imported its generators from German companies.
And they ran at 50 hertz.
They standardized at 50 hertz. Meanwhile, West Japan, so Osaka and that whole region, they bought American generators.
Which were 60 hertz?
Standardized at 60 hertz. And this dual frequency has just persisted. It means half the country operates on one frequency and the other half is on a totally incompatible one.
Okay, but obviously the country has to be connected. They must have found a way to link those grids. Otherwise, it's not a national system at all.
They have, but those connections are, in a very real sense, the weakest link in the entire chain.
They're the chokehold.
They are the chokehold.
Yeah.
The two grids, East and West, are linked by only a very small, very limited number of high voltage, direct current frequency converter stations, HVDC stations. And we are talking about just a few critical facilities, places like Sakuma, Shinshinano, and the Hida converter station. These things are basically massive, unbelievably complicated electrical transformers.
So they take the 50 hertz power.
They take the 50 hertz power, convert it to DC, and then convert it all the way back to 60 hertz power, or the other way around. It's the only way to get power to flow between these two zones.
I could get the need for them, but why are they such a critical bottleneck? I mean, why hasn't Japan just built more of them to handle the full national load if needed?
Well, the limiting factor is really threefold. It's cost, it's the physical footprint, and it's heat.
Okay.
First, these converter stations are just astronomically expensive to build and operate. We're talking billions of dollars. And then you have to consider the sheer physical space they take up. They need huge cooling systems, massive inverters.
So they aren't small.
Not at all. And then there's the physics of it. Converting AC to DC and back again generates a ton of heat, and you lose energy in the process. It just makes sharing power over long distances way less efficient than generating it locally.
So the total capacity of all these converters combined is just a tiny fraction of what the country actually needs.
A very small fraction. It's a completely artificial ceiling on their ability to share power.
That technical constraint, that ceiling, it makes the story of someone like Kenji, that engineer in Shizuoka, so important. He was living right on that frequency line during the 2011 disaster.
His experience, which is really well documented in the sources, perfectly illustrates this failure mechanism. After the earthquake and the tsunami wiped out a huge amount of generation capacity in the east.
Including Fukushima Daiichi.
Of course. The Tokyo region was completely crippled. Starving for power. They had to start rolling blackouts across the capital.
But the west of the country was fine.
The west, especially around Osaka, had a significant surplus of power. They had plenty to spare.
And the power just couldn't flow to where it was needed most.
Precisely. The power was there, but the physical infrastructure, those few limited HVDC converters, they simply didn't have the capacity to push enough of that surplus Western power into the 50 hertz Eastern grid.
So they couldn't stop the blackouts in Tokyo.
Couldn't prevent them. The infrastructure that was designed for, occasional load balancing in peacetime became this catastrophic bottleneck for national survival. It just laid bare the fact that Japan, for all its sophistication, has a fundamental single point of failure based on a technical decision from the 1800s.
So even though on paper Japan might have 10 different regional service areas for power,
right, it looks distributed.
It doesn't matter. The entire system is effectively centralized because the final decisions, the ultimate calibration of who gets power and who doesn't, that's all governed from Tokyo. It turns this vast, complex network into what our sources call a trap.
A trap. That's the perfect word.
Yeah.
It's a trap that ensures that any systemic failure in the capital automatically becomes a regional crisis, even if the regions themselves are physically untouched and have all the resources they need.
And this vulnerability, this trap, it leads directly into the bigger picture of national security and economic reliance, doesn't it?
It's the immediate next step.
Yeah.
You can't separate the grid from the economy.
So let's zoom out to that macroeconomic picture. Japan's dependence on imports is just a massive, massive vulnerability. They source almost everything from outside.
The numbers are, frankly, staggering. Japan sources about 87% of its total energy needs, and that's not just electricity, that's all energy, via these incredibly vulnerable maritime routes.
Sea lines of communication.
SLOCs, yeah. And when you think about the geopolitical situation in the Asia-Pacific, that reliance means the entire national energy supply is just highly susceptible to being cut off or blockaded at these maritime choke points.
That exposure to outside threats is the whole reason Japan has made this fundamental strategic shift, right?
Codified in the Economic Security Promotion Act, ESPA.
Yes, and that act didn't come out of nowhere. It was a reaction to specific critical junctures, as the sources call them, real-world shocks to the system.
What were those shocks that forced them to rethink everything?
There were two major ones. The first, and maybe the most specific, was back in 2010. The People's Republic of China informally blocked the export of critical rare earth minerals to Japan after a maritime dispute.
Wow, a direct economic threat.
It was a crystal clear demonstration of how economic coercion could be weaponized with immediate effect against a nation that depends on supply chains.
And the second shock?
More recent, and one we all felt, the COVID-19 pandemic. It just exposed these devastating fragilities across all global supply chains, from semiconductors all the way to masks and medical supplies.
So ESPA is basically Tokyo admitting that economic stability and national defense are the same thing.
They're inseparable. It's a comprehensive response designed to build real autonomy. So what are the operational pillars of this act, and how is it translating into actual money being spent?
The act is meticulously structured. It's designed to address the whole ecosystem of economic vulnerability. It has four main pillars.
Okay, what's the first one?
First is securing critical materials. So making sure you have a stable supply of things like rare earths, specialized chemicals, the components you need for high-tech manufacturing.
Makes sense. Second.
Second is protecting essential infrastructure, hardening utilities like the power grid we just talked about, but also telecom, financial systems, everything against both cyber and physical threats.
Third pillar.
Advancing technology. So promoting domestic R&D to maintain a technological edge, not falling behind.
And the fourth must be about protecting those advancements.
Exactly. Safeguarding patents.
Protecting your
intellectual property from foreign acquisition or outright theft.
And you said there's serious money behind this.
Very serious. The government has allocated over $12 billion specifically to subsidize domestic research and production of key materials.
Like what?
Notably, advanced semiconductors and high-performance batteries. The goal is to onshore those supply chains, reduce foreign reliance, and build up a robust domestic industrial base.
That's a huge financial commitment. It really highlights the strategic thinking. But if they're spending billions to secure fossil fuel supply chains and other materials, what's the argument for also accelerating the move to clean, distributed energy?
Well, the strategic argument for clean energy is actually the most compelling part of the whole long-term security plan. It directly attacks that import dependency problem we were talking about.
So it's not just about the environment.
Not at all. I mean, Japan's official targets are pretty conservative. They're aiming for maybe 36, 38% renewables by 2030. But get this. Independent modeling by the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, LBNL, suggests a much more ambitious path is technically possible.
How ambitious?
They're saying Japan could achieve a 70% renewable electricity system by 2035.
70%, that's a huge jump.
It is, but it's feasible, provided they commit to phasing out coal and not building any new gas infrastructure.
Okay, so let's say they did that. They hit 70% renewables. What is the actual security payoff? How does that make the nation tangibly more secure?
It creates enormous strategic advantages. I mean, first, it fundamentally slashes their reliance on those vulnerable maritime routes. If 70% of your power is coming from domestic solar, wind, and geothermal,
then 70% of your power can't be blockaded by a hostile navy.
Exactly. And second, and this is crucial for the national budget, the LBNL modeling estimates that a shift like that would cut fossil fuel import costs by an extraordinary 85%.
Let's just hang on that number for a second. An 85% reduction in fuel import costs. What does that free up fiscally in terms of defense readiness?
It translates into billions and billions of dollars annually that are no longer being spent on expensive, volatile international commodities like LNG and thermal coal.
And that capital can be moved.
It can be reallocated directly into defense. New destroyers, advanced surveillance systems, improving the readiness of their self-defense forces bases, and the distributed energy itself enhances resilience.
How so?
Well, decentralized generation makes those military bases less reliant on the main brittle grid. It improves their disaster response capacity. It's the very definition of turning an economic weakness into a strategic asset.
So pushing for clean energy isn't just an environmental policy. It's a non-military strategy for hardening the entire national defense posture.
It's pure strategy.
But if Japan is actively trying to harden its energy grid, where does that capital monster, that centralization, still have its grip? We mentioned the telecommunications sector.
Right, and that's where the institutional constraints are just so frustratingly obvious. Specifically, what's called the legal paralysis imposed by the legacy NTT law.
NTT, the big telecom giant.
The giant. This law was originally set up to manage the privatization of Nippon Telegraph and Telephone decades ago. But in practice, today, it has created this institutional hurdle that just effectively stifles any regional independent infrastructure innovation.
So how does one old piece of legislation manage to keep centralization locked in place, even in the digital age? What does it actually do?
It essentially mandates that the massive central telecom giant, NTT, remains the main and often the only authorized player in infrastructure development, especially at the local level.
It locks out competition.
Completely. The law creates these complex regulatory hoops you have to jump through to enter the market. It imposes high fees for local providers who want to use existing infrastructure like ducts and cables.
So it's designed to protect the incumbent.
It creates this powerful, slow-moving bureaucracy that's all about central efficiency and cost recovery for the big player.
And this is where we see the real human cost of that centralization in the story of Yumi, the municipal officer in that coastal town on the Noto Peninsula. She was just trying to build a lifeboat for her own community.
Yumi's story, it just perfectly highlights this conflict between local need and central control. She saw communications fail completely during previous disasters. Residents were cut off from emergency services, from relief efforts. She knew her town needed a backup.
It needed a communication redundancy system, a localized mesh network.
Exactly. And for anyone who's not familiar, a mesh network is basically a decentralized communication system. Every device, whether it's a router or a special phone, is connected to several other devices around it.
So there's no single point of failure.
None. If one path or one node fails, the data just automatically reroutes through another device. And crucially, these networks don't rely on some central tower or a distant connection all the way back to Tokyo. They are inherently resilient and autonomous.
The perfect solution for surviving a failure of the centralized system, but you're saying she was blocked.
She faced relentless bureaucratic resistance. Her proposal was shot down again and again by the central authorities who were all stuck in that NTT law mindset.
What was their reasoning?
It was deemed wasteful.
Wasteful.
Because it duplicated services that the central giant, NTT, intended to provide, eventually. It was also categorized as unauthorized infrastructure because it didn't fit into the standardized national framework that's built for central control and cost monitoring.
So her argument that resilience is more important than regulatory tidiness was just ignored.
Completely ignored.
That is just a chilling insight. The system actively prevents regions from becoming more autonomous, even when that autonomy is the only thing that could save lives in a crisis.
It shows that centralization isn't just about efficiency. It's about control, even at the expense of survival.
It proves that true regional autonomy needs more than just, administrative changes. It requires rewiring the fundamental arteries of communication.
Exactly. Until local communities can actually invest in and manage their own essential life support networks without a veto from the center, the entire nation is going to remain fragile.
That paints a really clear picture of the brittle system. So now we have to pivot to the complete opposite. Bhutan.
The antithesis, yeah.
We're moving from this hyper-industrialized state obsessed with centralized control to a Himalayan kingdom whose main metric is gross national happiness, GNH. And they're using energy for independence.
The contrast could not be more stark. Bhutan is a landlocked nation, famously prioritizing GNH over raw GDP. And they have one incredible, naturally decentralized resource: abundant, clean hydropower.
So the country is net carbon negative.
And powered almost entirely by renewable energy.
And they've found a way to use that clean energy to pull off this geopolitical energy arbitrage, basically converting the power of their rivers directly into digital assets.
It's a brilliant strategy, and it's being orchestrated by their sovereign wealth fund, Drug Holding and Investments, or DHI. They realized they often had what's called stranded power.
Stranded power.
Yeah, energy generated by their rivers that couldn't always be exported to India because of grid limitations, or they couldn't be used domestically because of low internal demand. And just letting that clean energy go unused is a pure economic loss.
So instead of letting it just go to waste, they decided to plug it into the global digital economy.
Exactly. They decided to use this resource to power a substantial national Bitcoin mining enterprise. And the sources, they paint this vivid scene. You have these pristine Himalayan forests on the outside.
Right.
And then inside, you have these humming rows of high-performance mining rigs, just converting the kinetic energy from the river flow directly into global, decentralized digital value. That's the daily reality for technicians like Dorji.
Is this just a financial play, though? Or is there a deeper, more philosophical goal here that's tied to their sovereignty?
Oh, it's absolutely about what they call the reconstruction of digital sovereignty. As a small, landlocked, developing nation, Bhutan relies heavily on traditional financial channels.
Channels controlled by bigger geopolitical players.
Overwhelmingly. So by converting their own internal renewable resources into a decentralized asset like Bitcoin, they're creating a financial system that can't be easily blockaded or sanctioned or controlled by a neighboring power or some distant banking system.
It gives them access to foreign currency liquidity that's outside of those traditional vulnerabilities.
That's it. They're using technological decentralization to leapfrog traditional geopolitical vulnerabilities. It is an incredibly strategic move.
It sounds like it.
But this whole initiative is also driven by deep domestic urgency. It goes beyond just external sovereignty. They are dealing with a massive human capital crisis at home.
Okay, let's talk about that urgency, this brain drain issue.
Bhutan has a small population, only around 800,000 people, and they are bleeding their educated youth. The statistics cited are pretty alarming.
What are they?
Youth unemployment hit 16.5% in 2024. And critically, over 10% of their young educated population left the country between 2022 and 2023.
10% in 1 year.
Looking for better economic opportunities abroad, especially in places like Australia. This is a severe existential threat to the nation's future.
But how does something like Bitcoin mining solve a human capital problem? It sounds like it would just generate revenue for DHI, the wealth fund.
Well, DHI sees this as a crucial tool for workforce retention and development. They aren't just plugging in machines and walking away. They are actively training Bhutan's youth in high-value, cutting-edge skills.
Like what kind of skills?
Things like blockchain, AI techniques, and advanced data center operations. This creates good domestic jobs in a future-facing industry. It offers sophisticated work that might otherwise require them to emigrate.
So it's a direct response to the brain drain.
It's an investment in local talent, designed specifically to keep their educated class at home.
So the financial benefit is tied directly into the social and developmental goals of gross national happiness. And they have a clear market advantage for their product, this verifiably green Bitcoin.
That is the strategic premium. Because their energy source is 100% clean hydropower, the digital coins they mine have this verifiable green provenance. And they're positioning themselves to sell these assets specifically to large global corporations.
Corporations trying to meet their ESG targets.
Exactly. Any major corporation or institution that has publicly committed to being carbon neutral or hitting net zero.
And what's the argument for why a company would pay a premium for that?
The argument is that buying a Bhutanese hydropower mine coin effectively offsets the carbon impact of one coin mined somewhere else using fossil fuels. And that justification allows DHI to command a premium price.
So they're leveraging their G&H philosophy and their environmental commitment directly into a successful global export strategy.
It makes their virtue financially viable.
That's a fascinating model for other developing nations. And this isn't just some small side project for them, is it? They're planning a massive expansion.
The commitment is absolute. Right now, Bhutan generates about 3.5 gigawatts of hydropower, but they estimate their full potential is around 33 gigawatts.
Wow.
And their intermediate plan is to significantly expand their infrastructure to hit 15 gigawatts of generation capacity in the next 10 to 15 years.
And that expansion is specifically to support the growth of their digital asset sector.
And to provide long-term, stable, exportable energy. It's a core part of their national strategy.
And we noted that the Prime Minister himself has endorsed this, right? Stressing that governments should recognize crypto mining's potential.
It's a clear top-down strategy. It shows a total philosophical alignment. Japan is using its energy infrastructure to reinforce centralized control and efficiency, and that's creating brittleness.
While Bhutan is using its energy infrastructure, its rivers, to decentralize finance and ensure economic independence.
Reinforcing resilience. The core contradiction really is about whether a nation wants maximum control or maximum independence.
This philosophical clash brings us to our final, and I think necessary, systemic critique: the disastrous cost of eliminating redundancy. We saw it in Japan, how that obsession with efficiency running lean actually created a catastrophic fragility.
This is the absolute crux of modern risk management. For decades, optimization and efficiency driven by things like just-in-time delivery treated redundancy as pure waste.
As fat.
As fat, yeah. Having spare parts, backup systems, alternative routes, it was all seen as inefficient. But as systems theory confirms, when you remove that fat, you are fundamentally removing the system's shock absorber. You can run really fast right up until you hit a wall.
Which means we need a complete intellectual shift in how we assess risk for critical infrastructure. We can't just be focused on load failure anymore.
No, the traditional model is all about load-based risk assessments. What's the probability that this bridge component will snap under a specific stress? We have to move toward a resilience-based framework.
Which assumes failure will happen.
It acknowledges that component failure is inevitable, and instead it measures the system's capacity to recover from disruptions.
Can you just elaborate on that fundamental flaw in the traditional design thinking for something like a major bridge, for example?
Okay, so think about the engineering standards for a critical bridge. The engineers will calculate a risk target. For example, they'll design the bridge to have, say, a 1 in 10,000 year risk of collapsing under a certain load or a collision.
Right, sounds very safe.
It does. But the fundamental flaw is that this risk target is often set completely irrespective of the catastrophic consequences on all the interconnected systems if that 1 in 10,000 year event actually happens.
So the design is focused on the integrity of the individual asset, not the survival of the network it's part of.
Exactly. It prioritizes the bridge over the regional economy it serves.
And that brings us directly to the Francis Scott Key Bridge collapse in Baltimore. A devastating real-world case study of a single point of failure, triggering these cascading, non-linear economic losses across an entire system.
The Key Bridge collapse was an instant failure watershed. The physical collapse was obviously catastrophic. It's a multi-billion-dollar rebuild. But the truly crippling cost was the systemic disruption from the 11-week closure of the Port of Baltimore shipping channel.
It choked off a vital East Coast trade artery.
And that closure cost the economy approximately $15 million in lost output every single day.
Our sources use this really sophisticated regional economic modeling, transite modeling, to quantify how far those cascading impacts spread beyond just the port. What did that data show about linear versus nonlinear losses?
The modeling was designed specifically to isolate and quantify that difference between an isolated failure and a compounded systemic one. And it showed very clearly that the combined bridge and port disruption created substantially larger nonlinear losses than if you just added up the individual costs of each.
So 1 + 1 did not equal 2.
It equaled 3 or 4. For instance, the combined 11-week scenario led to a staggering $1.412 billion reduction in GDP for the region. The losses were nonlinear because a disruption in one sector, say manufacturing that relies on imported parts, quickly compounded losses in other sectors like logistics, trucking, and warehousing.
That concept of compounding losses is so important. What about the asymmetry in the modeling? The difference in impact between the bridge closing versus the port closing?
The asymmetry was stark, and it was really illuminating. It confirmed which asset was the real single point of failure. The modeling found that the 11-week port closure, on its own, caused more than 6 times the employment impact of the 11-week bridge closure.
6 times?
Which clearly confirmed the port was the critical, non-reroutable economic hub. A bridge closure causes local inconvenience and cost for sure, but the port closure choked vital trade flows that just couldn't be easily absorbed by other ports like Philadelphia or Norfolk. It sent massive ripple effects through the national freight network.
And the most disturbing long-term finding from that model was the persistence of the labor force impacts. This wasn't just a temporary dip.
This is the long-term structural trauma that is so often missed by standard economic reporting that just focuses on GDP, while the model predicted that GDP and output would recover relatively quickly.
By 2026 or 2027.
Yeah, approaching baseline levels. But the impact on the labor force was persistent and incredibly long-lasting. In the more severe scenarios, these labor force reductions, from job losses, outmigration of skilled workers, people just leaving the workforce, they persisted all the way through 2040.
Wait, through 2040, that suggests permanent damage to the community decades after the actual event. Why do those labor force impacts linger so much longer than the GDP recovery?
They linger because specialized labor isn't fungible. You can't just replace it. The workers you need for a massive port operation, the crane operators, the longshoremen, the specialized logistics managers, they can't be trained overnight. And once they relocate for another job, they often don't come back.
So when a family leaves the region because the economic engine has stalled?
That loss of human capital is permanent. GDP recovers because capital investment and government spending eventually kick in. But the demographic and the labor force structure, that can take decades to repair, if it ever fully does. It just shows that eliminating redundancy in these critical hubs leads to existential risk, not just financial risk.
This brings us to a crucial final point about the Baltimore case study. The real-world impacts, in the end, were actually less severe than the model predicted. Why was there that discrepancy?
That discrepancy offers a really powerful lesson on the relationship between infrastructure design and policy agility. The transite model represented a hypothetical worst-case scenario, and crucially, it assumed no government intervention whatsoever.
A pure, uncontrolled failure.
Exactly. The reason the real-world impact was mitigated was because of rapid, aggressive federal and state policy interventions. You had Maryland passing the Port Act, federal emergency funding to speed up the cleanup, and these coordinated efforts to reroute trade and stabilize the local economy.
So policy intervention acted as a kind of expensive external shock absorber, making up for the lack of built-in resilience in the design itself.
That's the perfect way to phrase it. When you design a system that is fundamentally fragile, like the single unprotected pier holding up the Key Bridge or the centralized energy grid of Tokyo, you become completely reliant on the speed and competence of government intervention to manage the inevitable cleanup.
So the analysis confirms the value of both a rapid policy response
and the inherent distributed design resilience that makes those massive policy interventions unnecessary in the first place.
Okay, so we've established the theoretical danger of centralization and we've quantified its cost. Let's bring it full circle back to Japan. They are clearly responding to these threats. Natural disasters, climate change, geopolitical pressure, they're investing heavily.
They are.
What are their current resilience efforts, and how are they trying to build that resilience on top of a structure that is still fundamentally centralized?
Japan is implementing really extensive measures because they recognize the severe challenges from intensifying typhoons and earthquakes. On the physical hardening side, utilities like TEPCO Power Grid are investing billions into infrastructure reinforcement.
What does that look like on the ground?
It includes substantial projects to fortify transmission towers and a really significant push for the undergrounding of power lines, especially in those vulnerable coastal areas.
Undergrounding seems critical. It takes away the exposure to wind, to ice, to direct storm impact like Typhoon Faxai, which caused those massive prolonged blackouts in Chiba back in 2019.
It is a direct response to that historical vulnerability. And on the digital side, they're deploying some very sophisticated solutions to manage the existing grid more intelligently. This includes a large-scale rollout of advanced metering infrastructure, or AMI, smart meters, and distribution automation systems.
Specifically something called FEL-ISR.
FEL-ISR, yeah. Fault location, isolation, and service restoration.
So what does that actually do? How does FEL-ISR make a centralized grid more resilient?
Well, FEL-ISR uses sensors and smart relays and automated switches to detect the location of a fault on the line much, much faster than manual crews ever could.
Yeah.
But more importantly, it can automatically isolate that fault and then rapidly reroute power to the remaining healthy sections of the network.
So it minimizes the number of customers affected and the duration of the blackout.
It contains the failure before it can cascade.
Mm-hmm.
And they're also using other advanced measures, like deploying mobile power generators to disaster sites and using drone inspections for faster damage assessment.
These efforts sound very modern, very proactive. But I have to wonder if it's still fundamentally just patching a hole rather than replacing the boat. Are they successfully navigating that structural challenge of decentralization?
They are struggling with the structural hurdle. They're trying to integrate massive amounts of what are called distributed energy resources, DERers, solar, small hydro storage, into a grid that was designed from the ground up for large central power plants feeding outwards.
And the old design fights the new tech.
It does. The existing grid constraints create congestion, and that leads to high levels of renewable energy curtailment.
Curtailment,
Meaning clean power that has been generated has to be thrown away because the transmission lines or the centralized control system simply cannot handle it.
So they want the benefits of decentralized energy, the security, the independence, but they can't fully realize them because the control mechanisms, the institutional framework, that 50-60 hertz barrier, the regulatory hierarchy, all of that remains centralized.
Precisely. They are committed to building a resilient, decarbonized grid. But the cost of building that resilience on top of aging, dual-frequency, centralized infrastructure is just astronomically high and institutionally very complex. They had to deal with this fragmented energy governance that often sidelines crucial input from, say, defense and foreign policy experts about the risks of their fossil fuel reliance.
The contrast with Bhutan just remains so sharp. Bhutan built their independence from the ground up.
They married a naturally distributed resource to a technologically distributed mechanism. It's a completely different philosophy.
So if we synthesize everything we've gone through today, from the rigid control in Tokyo to the distributed independence in the Himalayas and that catastrophic cost in Baltimore, what is the central lesson here about the sovereignty trade-off?
The core lesson, I think, is really clear. Decentralization is not some political statement. It is a maintenance strategy for a fragile civilization.
That's a great line.
Centralization is addictive. It promises this elegant efficiency and easy top-down control, but it masks an extreme vulnerability to inevitable failure. True national security and survival, especially in a world defined by climate shocks and geopolitical instability, it demands that a nation's energy, communication, and financial arteries are fundamentally distributed and autonomous.
Meaning that real regional autonomy requires a complete and total rewiring.
It requires relinquishing the capital's grip and allowing the periphery, the regional hubs, the coastal towns, the local communities, the inherent capacity to manage their own networks, to generate their own power, and to maintain their own financial liquidity.
When we saw the NTT law block Yumi's attempt to build that simple mesh network,
we saw centralized administrative order actively diminishing the nation's capacity for survival. Fortifying the nation's survival system means embracing that necessary redundancy that for so long was seen as waste.
So the final thought really comes back to institutions, not just technology.
I believe so. The greatest challenge for advanced economies like Japan is not the adoption of new technology, which they excel at. Their challenge is having the courage to let go of the centralized control that their legacy infrastructure and their institutions enabled for so long. The future of national strength is not found in the elegant efficiency of a single powerful capital, but in the indestructible, distributed, and interconnected quiet of its many regions.